The school sat at the edge of a forgotten town, its paint peeling like time itself was trying to erase it. The wind often blew harder here, kicking up dust and memory in equal measure. And in the center of it all was her, a quiet woman with soft brown skin, tired eyes, and a voice only the wind had heard. They called her Miss Wren, the orphan teacher. She wore the same faded blue dress each day and never left the classroom until the sun had sunk low behind the prairie hills. No one remembered when she arrived. She simply started showing up, sweeping the floors, then slowly gathering the forgotten children who roamed barefoot and empty-eyed. She taught them with chalk stubs and makeshift books, writing lessons in the dirt when paper ran out. There was no salary, no recognition, only whispers and sideways glances. Some said she lived in the school. Others said she'd been abandoned here as a child and never left. Miss Wren believed in stories, not just the ones in books, but the ones children carried behind their eyes. She taught them how to spell hope and how to measure kindness. But the town didn't value that. Officials visited once, took one look, and left shaking their heads. She was a relic, they said, a ghost with a chalkboard. But she didn't care. Each morning, she opened the cracked door and stood there like a lighthouse, welcoming any child who wandered near. On the last day before everything changed, she stood alone. The kids hadn't come. Rain had threatened. The mayor had warned them to stay indoors. She knelt anyway, smoothing the dust at her feet. With one finger, she began to write, not a lesson, but a poem. Words that had lived in her heart too long. Words that rose like prayer. I have nothing but this dust and dream. Yet I teach with both. The rest trailed off as the wind scattered her lines into the sky. She didn't know someone had seen it. A stranger in a black car. A man whose name carried weight, and whose eyes had once searched for something real in a world built on speeches. The governor had been driving through on a forgotten inspection. His car had stalled near the school, and there she was, riding in the dirt, like truth couldn't be erased. He didn't say a word. He just watched. And read. Dust blew against the polished window. Inside the black government vehicle, the air was thick with silence. The driver had stepped out, cursing at the sudden stall. But in the back seat, Governor Rourke stayed seated. He wasn't looking at the dashboard. His eyes were fixed on the woman crouched near the schoolhouse door. She wasn't aware of him. She traced each word in the dirt like a secret confession meant for no one and everyone. He should have moved on. He had meetings, cameras waiting, speeches to give. But something in her stillness kept him rooted. He rolled the window down. The poem wasn't long, just a few lines written with a trembling finger. But it held more weight than anything he had read in office. Her last line, I give what no one can take. Love that costs me everything, clung to his chest. The driver returned, annoyed. Engine won't turn, sir. Might be a while. Rourke stepped out without a word. The wind pulled at his coat. The woman glanced up, just briefly, but didn't recognize him. She looked past him, as though her vision only saw children, empty seats, and forgotten dreams. Later, she walked away without erasing the poem. He stayed. The dust swirled around him, but the words remained. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her pain. But something inside him cracked. He took out his phone and took a photo, not for politics, not for press, but because something told him this moment wasn't small. It was the kind of moment that changes everything. By morning, the poem was gone, washed away by a short night rain. But the photo wasn't. It had already traveled. The governor's assistant had shared it with a local journalist. And within hours, the words written in dust began to spread across the internet. A teacher who teaches with nothing but love. That line echoed through every feed, caption, and screen. People didn't know her name, but they felt her spirit. In town, life went on as usual. Miss Wren, unaware of her rising fame, swept the classroom like always. She stitched up a child's torn shirt with thread from her pocket. She marked the corners of the room with dried sage to keep the air clean. When 2 hungry boys showed up, she divided her last piece of bread into 3. At the mayor's office, the phones wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters, nonprofits, even out-of-state education boards wanted to know more. Who is she? They asked. Is this real? The mayor, who had once ignored her request for chalk, now scrambled to find files, old school rosters, staff lists, anything. But there was nothing official. Miss Wren had no ID, no credentials, no paycheck history. Legally, she didn't exist. And yet, Her poem had stirred the nation. The governor didn't forget either. That evening, he sat in his office and stared at the printed photo of her dusty poem. He circled the final line with his pen. He had stood before thousands, delivered speeches that echoed in marble halls. But none of them ever touched him like the quiet plea of that orphaned teacher kneeling in the dirt. And somewhere far from politics and noise, she prepared the next day's lesson with a broken piece of chalk and a heart that refused to break. The town whispered louder now. Some said she was an angel, others a fraud. Rumors rippled through the community. She's just looking for attention, a jealous official said. We offered her help and she refused, another lied. But the children knew better. They called her the quiet fire. They came with empty bellies and heavy hearts, and she fed them all, not with food alone, but with stories that made them feel seen. Her classroom was small, but the windows were wide. Dreams flew through them like birds that had never known cages. When a team from a national newspaper arrived, she didn't know what to say. They asked for interviews, for background, for records. She said she didn't have much, just memories, and a few students who still remembered long division. They printed her story anyway. It went viral in hours. The teacher with no name. Headlines blazed. Her classroom has no walls. But her words reached the world. The governor watched it unfold. He made a quiet decision. He would return, not as a politician, not with cameras, but as a man who needed to say thank you. It was a Tuesday when the governor returned. No one announced him. No ribbon cutting, no media crew. Just him in a worn coat, walking the dirt road toward the schoolhouse like a man visiting an old friend. She didn't recognize him until he stood beneath the old oak by the school gate. She looked up from the dusty earth, chalk in hand, and paused. He approached slowly and knelt, just like she had. With one finger, he wrote beside her lesson in the dust. You taught me more than I ever learned in office. Her eyes widened. He smiled softly, then opened a small notebook. Inside was her poem, printed, preserved. He asked for her permission to read it aloud. She hesitated, then nodded. That afternoon, under the open sky, Governor Rourke read her poem aloud, to the children, to the wind, to the trees, and later, to the world. He didn't just recite it at the school. Days later, he stood at the State Education Summit and opened with her words. And for the first time in years, the entire room stood in silence. Not because they were told to, but because they were moved. The summit had seen decades of speeches, dry numbers, budget battles, and hollow applause. But that day, something cracked open. When Governor Rourke finished reading Miss Wren's dust-written poem, no one clapped. They simply stood. Some had tears. Others bowed their heads. The silence was louder than any applause. Across the country, viewers tuned in. The broadcast reached every classroom, office, and living room. Teachers, overwhelmed and underpaid, whispered, "She wrote what we all feel." Students reposted it with hashtags like #DustPoem and #TeacherTruth. Within 24 hours, national education pages flooded with tributes. Back in the forgotten town, Miss Wren remained unchanged. She still arrived early, still swept the floor, still gave her only apple to the hungriest child. The mayor, once dismissive, now offered her a new title, Honorary Educator of the State. She didn't take it. She said titles made people look at labels, not the work. But her world shifted quietly. Anonymous donations arrived. The roof was repaired. Books came in boxes. And the empty seats filled with children whose parents once overlooked her. Still, the poem remained unwritten in her class. When students asked to see it, she simply smiled and said, "It lives in you now." One morning, as the mist hugged the hills, a truck rolled into town with crates of polished stone. Workers unloaded planks, tools, and scaffolding beside the schoolyard. The children thought it was a mistake. The adults whispered again, this time not out of scorn, but curiosity. By week's end, a statue stood tall where the old garden had wilted. It wasn't a statue of Miss Wren. It was a stone wall with a poem, etched into it, the same words she'd written that day with a finger in the dirt. Below it, a brass plate read, "To the one who taught the world from nothing but love." The governor visited again, not in a suit, but in a plain jacket. He stood before the children and told them, "This wall isn't just for a teacher. It's a mirror, to remind us who we forget and who we become when we remember." Miss Wren never claimed it as hers. She sat under the oak, smiling as students ran their fingers over each line. Dust rose around them, but this time it wasn't erasing, it was remembering. Years passed. Leaders came and went. Schools rose and crumbled. But Miss Wren's poem endured, quoted in textbooks, whispered by teachers during hard times, painted in murals across cities. One winter, long after she'd passed away quietly in her sleep, a little girl named June stood before the marble wall. Her hair was braided like vines, her jacket too big, her heart full of questions. She was a foster child, quiet, lost. She traced the poem with trembling fingers. A teacher noticed and handed her a notebook. "Write your own," she said. And she did. June became a poet. Years later, she too stood before governors and read poems aloud, ones that spoke for the unseen. Meanwhile, Governor Rourke, now old and out of office, often sat by his window and reread that one photo, the dusty lines of Miss Wren's poem. He kept it beside his medals and awards, though he said none ever mattered as much. In his final public appearance, he held that photo and whispered, "We govern best when we remember those who write in dust."